Happy Friday and welcome back to Financial Wellness Fridays. I hope you all had an amazing week and were able to act on last week's challenge and apply for a credit card if you don't already have one. I thought because of last week's challenge, it would be super fitting to discuss how to use a credit card properly in order to build credit quickly, and also the 5 things that factor into your credit score, which is a major factor in lenders when they decide whether or not to provide you with funds or a loan. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, if you just got a new credit card and you want to know how to start building credit, or if you're trying to repair bad credit, go ahead and stick around for my best tips and tricks on how to build credit quickly and effectively. So there are 2 different ways to use a credit card. The first way is, I guess, the way that you're supposed to use a credit card, or what they're meant for, in that you max out the credit card, use it as a personal loan, and then take a couple of months or even years to pay it back by only paying the minimum payment every month. So for example, let's say you have a $1,500 credit limit and you go out and spend $1,500, and then every month you only make the minimum payment. That's how a lot of people use a credit card. On your credit card statement, there's going to be 2 balances. There's going to be the amount remaining, which is essentially the amount that you have on your credit card. So if you spent, $1,300, that's going to be, the balance on your credit card. And then there's also going to be the minimum payment, which is how much the company requires you to pay every month in order to avoid a late fee. But it's important to keep in mind that if you only pay the minimum payment, you're going to be incurring interest on the rest of the funds that are put on the credit card, or the rest of the balance. So it's important to keep in mind that if you only pay the minimum balance, you're going to be paying interest on the rest. So if you have, a 10% interest rate, you're going to be paying 10% on the leftover amount in addition to the balance that you already incurred on the credit card. So that's why I think it's super important to pay the minimum balance plus some, or hopefully all that's on your statement balance, in order to avoid incurring interest, because interest is essentially the cost of the loan, what you're paying to borrow that money. The second way to use a credit card is to essentially use it like a debit card. We've already gone over how to create a simple budget, and if you're using this budget plan, then let's say you decide to use your credit card on your 30% wants category. So you already know how much you can put on that credit card via the 30% of your income. And you should imagine that this is your credit limit. Instead of, the $1,500, $2,000, let's say, $500 is 30% of your income for that 2 weeks, then $500 should be your credit limit, because that's the amount that you can afford to pay back at the end of the month. If you use a credit card like a debit card, in that you pay the balance instead of that minimum payment on a credit card statement, you're not going to be paying any interest on the charges that you incurred on your credit card. You also, of course, won't incur any late fees because you're paying it before it's due. This is a super effective way to build credit, because you're showing lenders that not only are you making minimum payments, you're also making more than the payments, which means that you're being super responsible with the credit that you've been given. Some advice that I give people that are struggling a little bit with how much they can put on their credit card is to decide to just use credit cards for small purchases that you always make. For me, when I started with my credit card, I only used it to buy gas and then put my reoccurring monthly payments on it, like my Spotify account. And that way I was always keeping a low balance on it that I knew I would be able to pay back at the end of the month. This is an easy way for you to start using a credit card and building credit, but not get too overwhelmed by spending too much on the credit card. And I think this is super effective, and I've heard from a lot of people that it helps them a lot in order to just put a little bit on that credit card, still be using it, but not be tempted to pay more than they can afford to pay back. Credit card debt is one of the biggest debts that we want to avoid going into, because it is super, super hard to pay back. And it's super hard to cut that habit of overspending on your credit card once you've started it. So it's definitely something that we really want to avoid. So now let's talk about the 5 things that make up a credit score. A credit score is one of the major factors that lenders use in order to determine whether or not they're going to give you a loan. So it's super important to keep up with your credit score. One of the biggest factors in your credit score is the amount that you owe, or the amount of loans that you have taken out. So if you have a car loan, for example, that has $5,000 on it, then the amount you owe is $5,000. If you have credit card debt or a mortgage, those all go into the amount that you owe. And this is a pretty big factor, because lenders don't want to see that you have more debt than income, or even close to more debt than income. And some lenders won't even lend to you if your debt to income ratio is too high. So it's super important to keep the amount that you owe pretty low. The second big factor that goes into a credit score that's also really important and in your control is your payment history. This is something we were talking about a lot in the last video because credit cards are a super good way to establish that payment history. And payment history essentially is just talking about, are you making on-time payments? How much are you paying when you're making those payments? Not missing any payments, not being late on any payments. Those are all factored into on-time payments or your payment history, and those are super important because lenders want to see that you're going to be paying them back when you guys both agree that you should be paying them back. Because if you're not, then they're taking you on as a liability, you're probably going to have a higher interest rate, and all of those things aren't very good. The next 3 factors don't really factor in as much and they're less in your control, but they're still important to keep in mind as you go about, getting credit and things like that. The first one of those factors is your mix in credit. So a mix in credit is basically secured versus unsecured. What kind of loans are you taking out? That kind of thing. So for me, my mix in credit isn't very great because I don't have any secured loans right now. I used to have an auto loan, but it's been paid off. So my only loans right now are credit cards. That's the only credit I have extended to me. So this one you don't really need to worry about too much. It does factor into your score, but it's better to not have any loans than to take out loans in order to increase your mix in credit. But it's important to keep in mind to not have too many credit cards and that you're taking out too many unsecured loans compared to your secured loans. The next factor is new credit. So lenders don't want to see that you're applying for a bunch of credit right in a row because that looks like, I don't know if they're going to be able to pay me back because they keep asking for more and more credit. So new credit does definitely ding your credit score a little bit every time you apply for a new loan. These usually bounce back pretty quickly, so you don't need to worry too much about them. Make sure you're not applying for credit cards a couple of months before you're going to apply for a mortgage because then they're going to see that and be like, I'm not so sure if I should extend them credit since they just asked for this credit a couple of months ago. And the last factor in a credit score is one that was a big driving factor in my last week's video, and that is your length in credit history. Lenders want to see that you have a long credit history because otherwise, if you've only made like 3 or 4 on-time payments, that's not long enough to be like a good history to show, a consistent payment history. So your length of credit is super important because it shows lenders that you've been making on-time payments, you've been being a good steward of credit for 2, 3, 4 years. And that's why it's super important to start building credit young so that you can start that length of credit super early on. And another way that you can control this is to not close your oldest credit line. So keep that oldest credit line for as long as possible, which is why it's super important for your first credit line to be a credit card because that's something you don't have to close. If your first credit line is an auto loan, well, eventually that's going to go away. So those are the 5 things that are factored into a credit score. And of course, having a good credit score is important to show lenders that you are going to be a good steward of their loan. So my challenge to you this week is once you get that credit card, start putting just small purchases on it. Set up your automatic payments, make your gas payments with that, and make sure that you're paying it back on the due date, the full amount, or even before the due date, not just the standard payment. If you have any questions about credit card usage, let me know down in the comments. Of course, as always, subscribe, share with your friends if you think that they'll find this helpful, and like the video if you thought it was helpful. Have a great day, and we'll see you next Friday.